This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. Good evening. The nation's largest union today was taken to court on accusations that it is controlled by the mob. The government of the United States will try to prove what has been suspected and denied for years, that the Teamsters Union is corrupt, its leadership crooked, and its mafia connections deep. CBS News correspondent Harry Smith reports on the case and its importance.
The nation's largest trade union got hit by a truck today. The Justice Department moved to wipe the mob out of the Teamsters once and for all.
Today, the United States government is bringing a lawsuit to attack and to reverse a major American scandal, organized crime's alliance with the Teamsters.
Armed with more than 300 criminal convictions of Teamster officials and mob members over the last 18 years, the Justice Department is suing to get the top national union officials thrown out of office.
We shall win this fight as we have won all others. We will not stop until we prove this action for what it is, a shameful attempt to destroy a democratic union.
The suit reads like a who's who of union brass and crime bosses, including Teamsters president Jackie Presser and members of the Genovese and Lucchese crime families. If the suit works, a court-appointed trustee would take over control of the union until free elections could be held. That's touched off a firestorm of protest from the rank and file to Washington.
The majority of all the Teamsters wouldn't like it being taken over by the federal government.
I think it's outrageous.
I think it flies in the face of democratic principles, and it sets a very bad precedent. And I think it's very harmful for the trade union movement in America.
Government officials disagree.
It is, in fact, designed to give the members of the Teamsters what they deserve, and that is a union that represents them rather than organized crime.
Since the 1950s, the government has been trying to break organized crime's grip on the Teamsters. President Jimmy Hoffa was convicted of criminal activity, as was Roy Williams. An indictment is pending against current President Jackie Presser.
The Teamsters today are thoroughly rotten to the core. The only thing that will change that is a government-ordered takeover of that leadership.
But Justice Department officials insist the government is not trying to take over the Teamsters. They're just trying to take the mob out of the driver's seat. Harry Smith, CBS News, New York.
While the Teamsters were taken to court today, authorities also moved in on organized crime in another way. CBS News law correspondent Rita Braver reports.
The FBI and New Jersey State Police today arrested 22 alleged members and associates of the Genovese mob family, considered one of the country's most powerful mafia groups. The government says the case shows a unified and dangerous crime organization.
Also illustrates the connection between organized crime's violent activities, including murder, and some of its more seemingly innocuous activities, such as sports and horse gambling.
In particular, the Justice Department charges that some members of the Genovese family gunned down Irwin Schiff last summer in a New York restaurant, barely missing other diners. The mysterious 350-pound Schiff was said to be a con man linked to the rival Gambino family. And the indictment also charges some of the Genovese family members with conspiracy to kill the reputed head of the Gambinos, John Gotti. The murder never occurred. Those arrested today were herded into a local armory under tight security and, in an unusual move, arraigned there. The Justice Department says today's charges continue the government's strategy of going after the mafia family by family. Similar cases have been brought all through the Northeast, as well as in other cities across the nation. Those arrested today are allegedly part of the New Jersey branch of the Genovese crime syndicate.
What we're saying is we've taken that group down, and what occurs hereafter will determine whether or not it's been crippled or not.
In fact, the Justice Department is applying that logic not only to this case, but also to the alleged mafia infiltration of the Teamsters. Justice Department officials say the only way to control the mob is to keep pounding away at it day after day. Rita Braver, CBS News, Washington.
Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev today opened one of the few full Communist Party conferences ever held. This one could be decisive to Gorbachev's drive to overhaul the party bureaucracy and restructure the Soviet economy. It may also go a long way toward determining just how much authority Gorbachev maintains and how long he stays in power. Our coverage begins with Barry Peterson.
It was an evening of protest in a land whose leaders claim democracy is growing, police making quick arrests to block demonstrations, cracking down as they had promised because of the party conference. A conference that started with a 3.5-hour speech from Mikhail Gorbachev, a report card giving his nation's economy a very low grade.
Despite all the positive effects, the state of affairs in the economy is changing too slowly, especially if we judge it by the end result, that is the people's standard of living.
Gorbachev was only saying what his people already know, that after 3 years of radical change, this is a country still so badly managed, it can't even provide enough food for its own people.
I went to the store. What are they selling there? What products? Nothing.
And more, that the workers' paradise is a place where a lot of people don't work. They don't have to, since they're promised a paycheck no matter what. To fire up the farms and the factories and the people who work in them, said Gorbachev, let's bring more incentive, let's bring in profit. To Americans, that has a familiar ring.
In these incentives that you are mentioning, there is no difference between capitalism and socialism. But in order to live better, it is necessary to work better.
For Gorbachev, making these changes means convincing the delegates at this conference to go along with him. And many here see no need to change the old ways.
The danger is that they will block him, and by blocking him, they will convince the thousands of party officials and government officials all around the country that perestroika is not working.
While Gorbachev was busy politicking in the front hall, wife Raisa was working the crowd in the foyer. In this country, an unheard-of family push for perestroika. Also on hand, Delegate Boris Yeltsin, who was forced out of his top Politburo job for pushing too hard for Gorbachev's changes. A reminder that conservative opposition to Gorbachev is strong enough to force out even his closest allies. When Gorbachev came to power 3 years ago, he said he would change the system to make life better. His message today, it will take even more reform, even more sacrifice to deliver on that promise. Barry Peterson, CBS News, Moscow.
The political changes Gorbachev is trying to bring about are in some ways more revolutionary than the economic changes he has proposed. He's attacking the power and privileges of the Communist Party, the monolithic bureaucracy that regulates every detail of Soviet life.
We tangibly feel the resistance of the forces of inertia, this leading too often to half-cocked or compromised discussions, and sometimes to errors.
Gorbachev wants to cut the party down to size, leaving it with its ideological role, but stripping it of powers that duplicate government functions. In his speech today to the party leaders themselves, he proposed creation of an elected Congress and even a Western-style president. At present, the party bureaucracy runs the country, and the government is largely a rubber stamp.
We are learning democracy. Remember that Russia didn't have habits for democracy.
Unable to make much headway in reforming the economy, Gorbachev is out to transform Soviet politics, giving more power to local political bodies and taking authority away from party bureaucrats in Moscow.
There are too many bureaucrats, and we are pretty tired of them.
This cautious attitude to perestroika is very widespread on the part of ordinary Soviet citizens, workers, intelligentsia, farmers, whoever.
This new post of president that Gorbachev suggests would have broad powers, including authority over defense and foreign policy, powers that Gorbachev now shares with the Politburo. Many observers believe that if the Soviet constitution is changed, Gorbachev would be the clear front-runner as the first new president. Tom Fenton, CBS News, Moscow.
Terrorists in Greece today killed the in-country U.S. defense attaché. They did it with a bomb a short distance from his home. U.S. government spokesman vowed to work with Greek police to bring the killers to justice. Correspondent Alan Pizzi is covering this story from his base in Athens.
The attack was like something out of Beirut. A car packed with explosives blew up just as the U.S. defense attaché was driving by on his way to work. Navy Captain William Nordine's car was hurled onto the curb. The officer's body was blown out of his car and into the yard of a deserted villa. Greek police speculated that the blast was set off by remote control. The attack took place barely 100 yards from Captain Nordine's front gate, which is guarded by armed Greek policemen. American military personnel have been the target of a number of terrorist attacks in Greece. There had been an air of optimism in Greece that relations with the United States were improving along with Greece's image. The blast seems to have been designed, at least in part, to shatter that. No group has claimed responsibility for this latest incident, but Greek police suspect a shadowy left-wing urban terrorist group known as November 17. No member of the group has ever been apprehended, although it has been conducting its campaign of terror since 1975. The presence of American military bases, such as this key Middle East listening post and communication center for the U.S. Mediterranean Fleet, are cited as justification for the terrorist attacks. Security for the bases and Americans outside their perimeters is the responsibility of the Greek authorities. The U.S. Embassy in Athens issues alerts to its personnel whenever there is a sense that danger or an attack could be imminent. Today, there was no warning. Alan Pizzi, CBS News, Athens.
U.S.-Mexico relations plunged today with the U.S. recalling Ambassador Charles Piliad for consultations. The United States blasted the release of jailed Puerto Rican nationalist, terrorist, and U.S. fugitive William Morales as, quote, outrageous. Mexico announced yesterday it had allowed Morales to fly to Cuba. He was serving a jail term for murdering a Mexican policeman, but Morales had escaped from a U.S. prison in 1979 after his conviction for terrorist activities. The former CIA official indicted last week in the Iran-Contra conspiracy was arraigned today in federal court in Washington. Joseph Fernandez was the CIA's chief in Costa Rica. He pleaded innocent today to charges of taking part in a criminal conspiracy involving money and weapons belonging to the people of the United States. Fernandez's attorney called the case, quote, a tragedy for this nation because, he said, his client was only following U.S. policies. Still to come on the CBS Evening News, Bruce Hall on the Mississippi. Big River getting smaller every day. And Frank Courier on the Ausable, a little river on Loud. Of jagged wreckage from last night's rush hour commuter train disaster in Paris today yielded more bodies and more of the injured died. The official death toll rose to 59. Doug Tennell is in Paris.
Rescue workers were cutting through the twisted metal on the tracks of the Gare de Lyon for 24 hours non-stop. There just seemed to be no end to the casualty count in what has become one of the worst rail disasters in French history. The waiting train had been 6 minutes late, and so it had filled beyond capacity with commuters when the second train hurtled into the station, cutting through cars with a horrendous crash. In the early hours of today, medics set up a makeshift operating theater on the platform and began to surgically extract one survivor, whose legs were amputated in a 3-hour operation. Because these were commuter trains on routine runs, there were no passenger lists to match against identified casualties. No easy means of putting to rest the fears of families who may have had someone on board but could not be sure. And there was little relief for those who had the job of pulling the victims out of the wreckage. The government has promised an investigation, but it appears tonight that faulty brakes were to blame. Passengers on the incoming train were able to move to the rear cars and brace for the collision thanks to an early warning from the conductor that the brakes had failed. But people waiting at the platform at the Gare de Lyon had no warning at all of a commute that ended in catastrophe. Doug Tennell, CBS News, Paris.
The Canadian Parliament late today gave final approval to a pair of landmark anti-smoking laws. Starting next New Year's Day, all tobacco advertising in Canada will be banned. And on a date to be determined, smoking will be banned in all public places and on regulated air, train, and bus transport. Meteorologists today said that scattered showers predicted for later this week may ease some effects of the devastating drought in the Midwest. But no major relief there is in sight. And correspondent Bruce Hall reports that life on the Mississippi these days leaves room for sport, but not for business as usual.
The only movements on the river today were old steamboats taking part in the annual paddle wheel race from New Orleans to St. Louis. With a light load, they can get through the shallow water areas. Meanwhile, barge traffic has been brought to a virtual standstill again, with new blockages reported today at several spots between St. Louis and Memphis. In a meeting with barge operators, the Coast Guard said the new tightened load restrictions will continue, possibly through the summer. National Weather Service officials said conditions on the river are not improving.
quite honestly, the river has dropped a little bit faster than we thought that it might.
And barge operators were told low water conditions will continue through the summer.
There doesn't appear to be much rain in the forecast, so until we get probably the fall rains, we're going to have this problem exist.
In the south, farmers are setting up a hay lift, returning grain to drought-stricken Midwestern farms, repaying the favor of 2 years ago when Midwestern hay trains saved southern farmers from drought and bankruptcy. But a Shelby County, Ohio farmer is looking for immediate help from above, hoping the rain gods can read English and deliver. Bruce Hall, CBS News, Atlanta.
Pope John Paul created 24 new cardinals from 17 countries today in ceremonies at the Vatican. James Hickey of Washington, D.C. is one of the 2 new princes of the church from the United States, the other Edmund Sciocca, the Archbishop of Detroit. Today's additions bring membership in the College of Cardinals to 160. Vice President George Bush, again today, moved to distance himself at least a little from President Reagan on a specific issue, trying to better position himself for the election campaign. Bush came out for federal protection to prevent discrimination against AIDS victims. Mr. Reagan has yet to endorse the anti-discrimination proposal made by his own AIDS Commission. Bush also is increasing efforts to emphasize his flat-out opposition to any tax increases to help ease the federal deficit. Jacqueline Adams reports on what the Bush camp hopes will become the major campaign issue.
Republicans can hardly contain their glee. They believe the campaign began to turn their way last week when Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis raised taxes to balance his state's budget and said he'd consider doing the same thing if he were president.
We'll do whatever is necessary, thoughtfully and responsibly, to make sure that we have balanced budgets in the state, and I hope, if all goes well, that I can bring some of that same spirit to Washington.
And if what you're worried about is having your taxes increased, and if you're going to cast your vote on that basis, I think if I were the vice president, I'd feel fairly confident.
I am not going to raise taxes, period. He just has in his home state, and he refuses to rule out a tax hike for the nation. Now, we know what that means.
Mr. Reagan will raise taxes, and so will I.
This is what the Bush campaign would like voters to remember, and Democrats would like them to forget. Shades of Walter Mondale. And as Republicans see it, the Democratic love affair with raising taxes. But Democratic pollster Peter Hart thinks this year is different, that most Americans think, as president, Bush would raise taxes anyway, no matter what he says now.
The fact is they don't believe when you say never, because they know that they hear never too often, and the opposite turns out to be the case.
Some observers also think Bush's no tax hike pledge is extremely risky because voters will begin to wonder whether he'd cut Medicare, Social Security, and other entitlement programs to balance the budget.
For Bush to rule out taxes entirely is a way of saying to people he may not take the deficit all that seriously. The deficit to most Americans is the #1 problem facing the country.
Bush campaign strategists have been searching for ways to define Michael Dukakis for the American people. Now they say they think they've found it, casting him as a Democratic tax and spender, and Bush as the defender of the voters' pocketbooks. Jacqueline Adams, CBS News, Washington.
CBS News has been told that New Jersey Governor Tom Kean will be the keynote speaker at the Republican convention in New Orleans in August. World, it is indisputably Mike Tyson. He proved it last night, demolished Michael Spinks in Atlantic City, New Jersey. It was a battle of statistics, 23 punches thrown by Tyson, according to one count, 10 thrown by Spinks, who was dropped twice, the second time once and for all. The whole thing lasted 91 seconds, meaning the two men earned about $750,000 a second. It's a long way from the violence of the prize ring to the serenity of fly fishing. Boxing is brutal and bloody. Fly fishing, with its tangled lines and the one that got away, is a reminder of human limits. That's under ideal conditions. Frank Courier explains what happens when big guns enter the picture.
Knee-deep in the riffles and runs along the crystal winding waters of the Asable River, fly fishermen cast in search of native rainbow trout. But anglers worry this tranquil trout stream in Michigan's remote north woods is becoming a combat corridor.
You're going down the river, and you're just into the river, into the fishing, and all of a sudden, kaboom!
It's the kaboom in stepped-up, round-the-clock training that's putting frustrated fishermen and fighting men at odds. The summer sounds of pounding artillery at nearby Camp Grayling, America's biggest Army National Guard post and temporary home to tens of thousands of weekend warriors.
Turn and burn, turn and burn.
We train 24 hours a day. I mean, war is fought 24 hours a day. It's not fought just in the daytime.
I don't like them dropping flares in the middle of the night when I'm fishing in the dark.
Sportsmen and outraged retirees living in a swank lakefront subdivision near the bombing range have turned from fishtails to war stories.
Last year, we had the Italian Air Force dropping bombs.
Well, I've laid awake at nights and heard the pop of the gun firing, and then wait for the shell to fall.
And it absolutely shakes our roof, it shakes our walls, it shakes our dishes.
When the artillery cools down, fishermen say they hear helicopter gunships thundering just over the treetops.
We're using Apache helicopters. We've got A-7s, A-10s, we've got jets. We're going to have a helicopter come over our head here in a second.
While shell-shocked fishermen shout, "Not in my backyard," National Guardsmen who've been in Grayling 75 years remind their sleepless neighbors who was here first.
I enjoy total wilderness experiences. I go off and camp and fish like anybody else. I don't look for that wilderness experience next to an active Army training facility, however.
And neither do many of Grayling's 2,000 town residents who depend as much on guardsmen as they do tourists and who are willing to put up with rockets and mortars in return for an estimated $25 million a year on the economy.
Well, I tell you, it's amazing how much money they drop in the community.
But when a fabled trout stream meanders for miles across an active battlefield, there's little common ground between sportsmen and guardsmen.
When they're not here, it's heaven. When they're here, it's hell.
For as sure as the choppers will keep firing missiles near the edge of the forest, stubborn fishermen will keep casting and hoping one day tranquility will replace artillery along the Osable River. Frank Courier, CBS News, Grayling, Michigan.
And that's the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather. See you tomorrow. Good night.
I'm Harry Smith.
And I'm Kathleen Sullivan. Tomorrow, the real men of the movie Bull Durham, the Durham Bulls baseball team.
Also, Hugh Hefner, tomorrow on CBS This Morning.
This is CBS.
Who flies overnight letters for just $8.75? Watch the birdie. Express Mail overnight service from your post office.